Good morning, everyone. I am Wendy Edelberg. I'm a senior fellow in economic studies at Brookings, and I am delighted to invite you to our event, to welcome you to our event, The Supply Side of Inflation, How Shocks Affect the Outlook. The last few years, since the pandemic disrupted so many aspects of the supply side of our economy, have brought renewed attention to how supply side factors affect inflation. And so I am thrilled to be joined by our three panelists who you'll see in a few minutes. Seth Carpenter, who's the Global Chief Economist at Morgan Stanley. Julia Coronado, the president and founder of Macro Policy Perspectives, and Catherine Wolfram, the William Barton Rogers Professor in Energy at MIT. And we will be having a conversation about what supply side factors are on their minds and how they see those factors potentially affecting inflation, not just in the current economy, but going forward. Before we do that, I'm going to present some work that I just published, creating a taxonomy of the recent literature. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen. All right, there you are. I think you now can see my slides. And what I did with this paper is I spent several months systematically reviewing a whopping 88 academic and policy papers on supply shocks and inflation. My thought was to look at this literature and try to drill down on how the literature grapples with supply shocks and inflation. It's not just supply shock inflation. There's lots of different kinds of shocks, and there's lots of different ways that supply shocks can lead to inflation. And so I created a taxonomy. I thought about what were all of the different supply shocks that the research grapples with. And I thought about how those supply shocks are transmitted through the economy, and then how they're amplified. So for example, a semiconductor shortage works completely differently from an oil price spike, which works completely differently from the pandemic lockdown. And yet all of those created supply side shocks that led to inflation. And of course, it's incredibly important for policymakers to understand what kind of supply shock they might be facing in any given moment and how that supply side shock is potentially affecting inflation. So again, 88 papers. The papers span from 1995 to 2025, but to be clear, a lot of them were published since 2020 in the wake of the pandemic. There are 8 different shock types that I found were common in the literature, and I'll describe those in a moment. And then I had identified which economic function was hit first. Did it raise production costs? Did it hit supply chains? Did it tighten labor markets? And then finally, I identified what amplified the initial shock, things like low substitutability, network propagation, or sticky prices. This created 130 distinct shock channel amplification combinations that I could analyze for patterns. In the paper, I spent a fair amount of time thinking about and writing about what is most commonly discussed in the literature. Certainly that reflects what's most on these researchers' minds, but it doesn't necessarily reflect what's most important, and certainly not what's most important for the future. So, but by reporting how commonly different things have been analyzed, hopefully I can also give a sense to future researchers of where we might have some holes. All right, so here are my 8 different types of supply shocks. There's global supply chain disruptions that might sound familiar to anybody who thought hard about what happened to the economy in the wake of the pandemic, the global economy. Global supply disruptions create bottlenecks, shipping delays, logistics breakdowns. Then we have pandemic shocks. There is a lot of the literature that really like laser focused on the pandemic. And so I wasn't able to pull apart one particular shock that researcher was thinking about. And it seemed useful to me to think about how a pandemic shock, in all of its complicated characteristics, could affect the supply side of the economy and inflation. Productivity shocks, this is a classic in the literature. Productivity goes down. That's a supply shock. How does that affect inflation? That's quite common in the literature, and indeed quite common in the literature before the pandemic. Commodity price shocks, oils, metals, food prices, anything where there's particularly a global trading system where we just can see a global price increase. Natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and indeed, I'll be asking Catherine Wolfram lots of questions about potential climate shocks going forward. Import price shocks, this is anything that could, in particular, just increase the price of inputs. I completely get it that a global supply chain disruption can also increase the price of imports, but import prices can be affected through changes in trade policy, particularly relevant for today, exchange rates, and the like. Critical input shocks, these are semiconductors, specialized components, the kind of thing where it may actually be a relatively small aspect of production, but a completely critical one. So if there's disruptions in supply of that critical input, the entire production chain can come to a screeching halt. And then labor supply shocks, worker availability. And I can say I see on my screen that these are cut off a little bit. I apologize for that, but look in the paper, they're all there. All right, transmission channels. So how do these shocks affect the economy? Different papers grappled with these differently. And to be clear, I had to use a lot of judgment when I read these 88 papers and thinking about not just which supply shocks they were analyzing, and everything had to come into my taxonomy, but I had to use a lot of judgment to think about how were they transmitting these supply shocks through the economy. The production function, that's an obvious one. You have an increase in input costs, and that simply makes production of a given good more expensive, harder to do. The same amount of resources are going to produce less than they did before. Network, what I have in mind here is that things just transmit through the economy through input-output linkages. So if you make a supply of a given factor more expensive, then it may well be that whatever firm is supplying that factor is now going to demand less from whoever's upstream from them in the production chain. And so that upstream firm is now going to, in a sense, feel that same shock. Consumer spending, there's a bunch of different ways that supply shocks can distort consumer spending, change the composition of it. So think about a natural disaster. A natural disaster can quickly change the kinds of goods that consumers want and don't want. And that can be a way that something like a natural disaster transmits its economic effects through an economy. Supply chains, logistics disruptions. So again, think of the natural disaster example. Natural disasters can affect supply chains. Labor market, this is just kind of a basic one. When there's less worker, when fewer workers want to supply their labor to the market, firms are going to see that as disruptions in the labor market. And then pricing power. This one's a little subtle, but the idea is that in the face of certain kinds of supply shocks, certain firms will just, as a matter of course, increase their markups. They will say they're going to increase their prices that they're charging relative to their costs. I thought of this as a transmission channel and not an amplification mechanism in this sense. You're going to see about a second about amplification mechanisms in a slide or two, because in some regards, this could just be a level effect to prices. This could just be that firms, in response to a price, in response to a supply shock, increase their markups, and we could be done. We could be, that could be the end of the story. It doesn't necessarily have to get amplified beyond the initial shock. So one complicating factor is that not all negative supply shocks in this literature cause inflation. And in fact, in some regards, negative supply shocks can reduce inflation. So for example, when productivity decreases, the relationship with prices isn't always straightforward. So a productivity shock doesn't necessarily increase inflation. Think of an unemployment risk channel, which is something that's grappled with in the literature. You get a negative productivity shock, it makes it harder to find a job. And what that might mean for even workers who remain employed is that they increase what's called precautionary savings. They just decide that the future is less certain, and so they increase their rates of saving. That reduces consumer demand, and now you have a deflationary impulse to the economy. Similarly, you can have sticky price sectors where some sectors can be very slow to change their prices, even following a supply shock, and that can disrupt things and disrupt production in a way that means that supply shocks don't necessarily increase inflation, and certainly not right away. These things are worth dwelling on for a moment because these really matter for monetary policymakers. Monetary policymakers might want to take into account that there are some deflationary effects in the economy, even following a negative supply shock. So the amplification mechanisms, these are the ways that these kinds of supply shocks that I've talked about, the 8 kinds of supply shocks, are commonly in the literature shown to be amplified. They're going to be intuitive, but I thought, it was worth being concrete and labeling each of them and thinking about, for each paper, how was the shock amplified? Substitutability can be low. You can't just raise disrupted inputs. Production stops entirely. Networks propagate. So this isn't just how things are transmitted. This can be that at every node in the production chain, the shock can actually get amplified and get, magnified, synonym for amplified, and that can get larger and larger as the shock propagates both upstream and downstream. When inventories are lean, we can see that shocks can have particularly large effects on the economy. Prices are sticky. In some papers, this is actually an amplification mechanism because sticky prices mean that firms don't have all of the most efficient price discovery. And so prices can, and so supply shocks can actually harm the efficiency of production quite broadly. Expectations unanchored. This is a big one for monetary policymakers. And if a supply shock may well have very temporary effects on inflation, and yet expectations become unanchored, then now if people just begin to bake into their behavior expectations of inflation remaining high, that temporary effect on inflation can become persistent, at least for a time. And then market power exists. So concentrated firms can raise markups without losing market share. I thought of this differently as the transmission channel that I described on the previous slide, in that with enough concentration, with enough market power, firms can amplify the inflation shock when they, something gets disrupted and they increase their markups, and then that can actually lead to further disruptions, and then they further increase their markups. So market power can actually amplify the shocks. Policy implications. So my hope is that by creating this taxonomy, I give a sense to policymakers, both monetary policies and fiscal policymakers, about what to monitor. You might think about building resistance in your economy by tracking input substitutability. Which sectors depend on irreplaceable components? Network concentration, where are critical supplier bottlenecks? Inventory positions, do we see that there are safety, do we see that stocks are adequately built up so that the economy is resilient to a potential shock? And then in market concentration, can dominant firms exploit disruptions? So hopefully this framework is useful. I certainly don't mean it to be the end of the story, and I have no doubt that some of the authors of these 88 papers are going to disagree with how I have interpreted their research and what boxes I put things into. I did not mean this to be the final word by any stretch. My hope is that by creating this taxonomy, I give us a more concrete language to think about how supply shocks matter for inflation. It's not simply supply shock inflation. There's many different kinds of supply shocks. There are many different ways they can matter, and there are many different ways they can be amplified. You can see this on the Brookings website, and lots of gory detail of how I've thought about these 88 papers. And with that, I am now very excited to welcome Catherine and Seth and Julia to the screen and have our conversation about what's on their minds with regards to supply shocks and inflation. So I'm going to ask each of them in turn to tell me what's most on their mind, and then we'll open it up to a conversation. I've gotten a bunch of questions from people who have registered for the event. Thank you so much. If you have questions while you're watching, you can email them to events with an S, @brookings.edu. And with that, all right, Julia, tell me what is most on your mind.
Okay, so first I wanted to thank you for creating the taxonomy. It was a heroic effort. I think it is a useful taxonomy and very much the way we approach inflation forecasting. That is, we do a considerable amount of bottoms up in addition to top down, in which case we're thinking about industry dynamics and market competition and consumer preferences at the time. So this can create a lot of nuance to inflation cycles above and beyond kind of the top-down Phillips curve style macroeconomic view. So this is very much aligned with how we think about inflation, and it matters a lot. I think what the pandemic taught us is that thinking about things in this way matters a lot. And so I wanted to kind of walk through two areas that we're thinking about right now, and specifically comparing and contrasting where we were in the pandemic, the kinds of dynamics we saw during the pandemic, and the kinds of dynamics we're seeing now. And if I can, I'd just like to share some pictures, because I always think visually. So very simple pictures I'm going to share with you. And let's see, I'm going to do me a little slideshow. Okay, so right now you should be looking at a picture of auto prices. I think that when I think about auto, so car prices is one area that was very central to pandemic inflation. And using your taxonomy, I think we had a combination of supply side shocks and amplifications through the transmission channels. So the supply side shocks included the pandemic itself. The pandemic led to shutdowns in factories, and then that interacted with critical inputs. So I remember the Malaysian chip factory shutdown. It's very clear in my mind where we got a second wave of inflation because we had specific chips that were critical to completion of cars, and we just couldn't produce the cars. So it was the pandemic that caused the shutdown of the factory. It was a critical input. And then it got moved through the global supply chain, moving things around also got sticky and messy. The amplification came through consumer spending channel. So preferences were shifting in favor of cars. People were doing pandemic migrations. They were leaving big cities with public transportation to suburbs and smaller cities. They didn't want to be on buses and trains with sick people. So they wanted more cars. And pricing power channel. We were dumping cash on people to get them through the pandemic. So lo and behold, they were much more willing, even in a competitive industry. And this I will, use a moment to claim grace for those of us who were on the transitory channel. This chart illustrates very nicely that car prices have never been a part of the business cycle in a large way. That in fact, if anything, they tend to go down, not up. And so we did not expect to see this level of inflation. And then while this is just the level of car prices, sure looks like a level change in prices. But remember, it came in a few steps. And then we got it amplified through services. So the Fed's taxonomy of goods, housing, and super core services, well, it's not that clean because most of super core service inflation over the past few years came from car-related services. It came from car insurance, which I know Catherine's going to touch on for other reasons. But it also came through car repair, car rental, anything that had to do with cars. Had a second and third round of price increases tied to this initial level shift in car inflation. Where are we now? Well, tariffs, using your taxonomy, are an import price shock, right? So they're going to be transmitted through the production function. But now if we think about the other transmission channels, and that should mean, more expensive production costs, more expensive cars. Pretty simple. But we're not really seeing that much pressure on car prices. And that I think I attribute to two offsets. In contrast to the pandemic, now we're back in the world where cars are a durable good. You can move it around across time. You don't have to buy, you may not have to buy a car now. And so if it gets more expensive, you might repair your car, wait and see, make it last another year. And second, the pricing power channel is, back to where it used to be. We don't have a population awash in liquidity. Instead, we have very price sensitive and constrained, budget constrained median consumers. And so we're actually getting some offset. And I've heard somebody in the auto industry talk about how automakers are just going to have to choose between margins and quantity. Are they going to let these tariffs compress their margins? Because they will. They've been holding on for now, and protect their margins, or are they going to and accept lower quantity, or are they? I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to this. So very different dynamics from the pandemic, and I think that this way of thinking of things helps us understand that. Now let's talk about the other thing, the other area of focus for us, and that's immigration. So immigration is a labor supply shock. And it was during the pandemic, actually. We did have a restriction in immigration during the pandemic, and that led to some temporary restriction in labor supply. At the same time, there was a lot of restriction in labor demand. But then we had the wave of immigration that we saw between 2022 and 2024. And you've done such valuable work on this, Wendy. If people need to know how to think about this, look at Wendy's work. I use it all the time. But I've just got a couple of illustrations. The left-hand side chart here shows you mortgage rates. That's the blue line. And then it shows you building permits. So, mortgage rates went to record lows. We saw a surge in demand. That's textbook. Then we saw the Fed catching up. They raised rates, mortgage rates surged, and initially permits went down. But then even as mortgage rates stayed high, we had this surge in building activity. And this comes back to the literature. I think the transmission of labor supply and particularly immigration shocks is very complex. It's complex because a lot of the literature that's looked at these dynamics finds that immigrants are complements to domestic labor, not substitutes, particularly in housing, which is so immigrant dominated. And I think, again, using your taxonomy, I think of this as, it's not just labor supply. When we think macro, we think immigration, labor supply, it's a demand and supply shifter, right? All else equal, you could think about more people, more demand, more supply, the potential growth moves up and down in tandem. Not necessarily. The immigration shock is a lot like a supply chain shock. If you think about the nature of construction, it is very layered and complex. You need to do A, then before you do B, before you do C. Immigrants are particularly dominant in framing crews. So when you don't have the framers, then you can't have the electricians or the plumbers come in after you. So if you gum up that initial phase, you're going to have ripple effects. So some of the research that's looked at the Obama era deportation policies, and that was rolled out on a county by county basis over time, allowing researchers to identify the effects. And they concluded that the response of the industry is not necessarily to tighten up the labor market. It doesn't lead to increased demand for domestic workers necessarily. It just slows the whole industry down. And that their conclusion from this literature was that that deportation policy led to or contributed to the underbuilding we saw after the GFC and upward pressure on home prices. So this is the trick for inflation right now. And I'm showing you too, the right-hand side. So on the left-hand side, you can see that building permits have fallen off of late, even though mortgage rates have come down. So that doesn't seem to be a demand effect. And this is corroborated by the right-hand side chart, which shows you mortgage applications are flat. If anything, they're up a bit this year relative to last year. So we can't attribute that decline in building to demand. It's more likely supply. And then you look at construction hiring, it's gone to net negative or basically zero. We do see some upward pressure on wages and salaries in the construction industry, but the unemployment rate's very low. I think when I think about how this restrictive immigration is going to affect inflation, I think of it less through the labor market channel and more through the building channel, more through the supply channel. We're not going to build enough over the next few years. We're going to fall behind again. And that's going to mean rents and home prices are going to be sticky and elevated. So it may not show up with the timing and the channels that we expect, but it is probably inflationary nonetheless at the end of the day. So those are the way I'm thinking about things. And again, the taxonomy that you've laid out is extremely useful for helping us do that. Okay, where are we now? And how does that differ from episodes we've seen in the past? So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Julia. And your use of my taxonomy is quite heartening. Thank you. Even if you're the only one who ever uses it, enough. I feel good about my work, even if I have an audience of one. All right. Seth, I know you've thought about some of those same issues, so happy to hear where you want to amend or expand, but you've thought about other issues as well. Tell me what's on your mind with regards to supply shocks and inflation.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I'd like to echo Julia's thank you to you for inviting me here, the folks at Brookings, because you all always put on really great programming like this. And I will also echo that I think the taxonomy is important because as I get into some of my discussion about some of the things I've been thinking about, AI shocks, inflation, that sort of thing, I think it's critical that someone has a taxonomy along the lines of what you have, both for the reasons that you stated, give you something concrete to argue about, but also because there are lots of moving parts that if you don't start to build up the vocabulary for how to talk about the differential effects, you really run into sloppy analytics. And so I think that kind of framing is super helpful. On Julia's comments, I thought, especially at the end, the point about some of the labor supply shocks from the immigration restriction and how they might end up being inflationary, I think that was really helpful. And I want to amplify one part. I think Julia, both of you, in fact, are absolutely right that people have these mental shortcuts. That there's a supply shock that's got to be negative for push up inflation, negative for quantities, and digging deeper, I don't think happens that often. I think there's a real need to do that, and the labor supply shock from immigration restriction here is one that's really important. And I just want to amplify Julia's point about needing to think about production functions, not simply is it fewer workers, tighter labor market, Phillips curve gives you higher inflation. And I think one of the lessons we should have all learned from COVID, from the supply chain disruptions that we saw there, especially for labor, is that sometimes it really comes through the quantity supplied to the market of a good or service, and not because the labor market is tight. So what do I mean? I think a lot of people have in mind that we're going to have a tight labor market because of immigration restriction. Wages will go up, and then some sort of constant markup model is going to drive higher inflation. And I'm kind of a seller of that model for what's important right now. I think most of the long-term empirical evidence in the US says the correlation between wage inflation and price inflation, most of the causality goes from price inflation to wage inflation. I would take a page out of what Julia was saying and think we're going to have in construction, in some of the hospitality and leisure services area, just an inability of firms to find workers. And as a result, they'll be supplying less of their product to market, and conditional on demand, that reduced supply is going to be the thing that drives inflation. So coming out of the pandemic, we heard about hotels, that 20-story hotels where the top 10 floors were just left vacant because they didn't have workers to do the cleaning and upkeep. It's not because hotel workers' salaries went up so much that they had to charge more, is that they simply didn't have the staff and they couldn't do it. The New York resident-centric version of the world, it comes to restaurants, where restaurants maybe close down part of their dining room or close down one of their dining rooms, and you just can't get a table. And as a result, the price goes up in that direction as well. So I think Julia's highlights there about the need to think a little bit more creatively about labor supply was spot on. But I guess a different topic for me a little bit is AI, and I think it highlights similar types of complications. And here, despite this supposed to being about supply and supply affecting inflation, I think one of the things for me that comes up in conversations most of the time, talking to people about the effect of AI on inflation, is that there's both a demand and a supply effect here that we have to keep in mind. And I think by needing to separate those sorts of things, going from partial derivative to total differential, thinking about things, separating supply and demand, it highlights, Wendy, the taxonomy work that you did and why that sort of precision is necessary. And I would say this mixture of aggregate demand and aggregate supply from AI is very true, and in more than one way. So for instance, right now, a lot of the discussion in markets and in macroeconomic forecasting is about CapEx spending, AI CapEx spending, and that's a very clear demand enhancing, demand boosting side of things, which at the margin should be inflationary. But people are also talking about the aggregate supply, the productivity enhancement from AI, and that should be disinflationary. So we need to think about them together. But it's more dynamic than that as well, because if you think about it in some of the macro models, growth models that we learned about as graduate students, higher productivity growth should mean faster potential growth, which in and of itself could be disinflationary. But over time, that probably also means higher expected incomes, some of which should be pulled forward for more spending now, which then should be inflationary. And so I think people who are looking for a very simple AI is going to do this to inflation really need to take a step back, read more of Wendy Adelberg's work, and think about the taxonomies of supply and demand, and then the channels through which these things are going to work. The demand side of thing, I think, is pretty clear in some ways. So, even if it gets exaggerated, so there are lots of people who are saying things like, oh, there'd be no US GDP growth this year if it weren't for AI CapEx. Those are overstated and not doing enough of the NIPA accounting, but nevertheless, it really is big. The wealth effect in terms of spending for consumption is there and it's big. Part of that is from higher equity prices, some of which is this capitalization of future productivity or future benefit from AI. So I think there's a lot of that going on at the same time already now in the data. The supply side, I think we have to keep being creative and try to find out where it's going to be. There are surveys that are done, adoption rates are rising, but depending on which surveys you look at, still on the low side. So I think there's a lot more ahead of us. Finding use cases for how to deploy AI tools could actually be negative for productivity in the short run. So it could be one of these negative productivity shocks if we devote an hour each day to try to find the best use case for productivity. At some point, that will be great for me. But right now, when I'm using this hour to find a use case as opposed to deploying it, that's negative for productivity. And then I guess the other point is so much news is coming out about data centers being built, how large they are, how much money is going to be spent, but they are years off to completion. And so it's hard to believe that the true promise of productivity gains from all of AI is going to be there before we have these data centers as fully functional. So I still think there's a lot more on the supply boosting side to come. Now, to think about the labor market effects, one thing I think that is really important to remember is it depends on the speed with which the AI tools are rolled out, the adoption is rolled out, the use cases are found, the productivity growth goes up. But I also think it's really important to think about the state of the business cycle. So again, when it comes back to your paper, thinking about transmission mechanisms and maybe propagation mechanisms, because I do think the state of the business cycle matters. Specifically and very simply, if you were to see this big increase in labor market productivity when the labor market is extraordinarily tight and we're back at, say, 3.5% unemployment or lower, I suspect very strongly that's going to have very different implications for inflation, for the labor market, than if you have this boost in labor productivity when the unemployment rate is up at 6.5% and labor demand is either low or falling. So that's important to keep in mind. The extreme version of the world is not someplace where I am now, the sort of labor market collapse version of the world, where very quickly all the tasks that humans can do are done by machines. Could happen, and there's some very careful academic research done here, but that's not where my base case is right now. I'm in the camp, at least for now, that there's going to be some mix of labor displacing technology advancement and labor augmenting enhancement. Again, sort of echoes some of what Julia said about whether or not immigration is a complement or a substitute for domestic born workers. I think we need to think about AI sometimes being a substitute and sometimes being a complement for labor market. People have tried to make a lot about this and looking at entry-level jobs and asking, are we destroying demand for entry-level workers? Couple pieces going around looking at very narrowly, thinly sliced, like 22 to 25-year-olds since the release of ChatGPT, for example. And I think those types of papers sort of overstate the doom and gloom scenario. So since ChatGPT, for instance, was released, aggregate unemployment went up. And if you just take the normal correlation between youth unemployment and aggregate unemployment, got a beta of more than 1. And so the fact that you see a bigger increase in unemployment among those young workers maybe isn't surprising given regular business cycle dynamics. 3-year cohort, pretty fine slice of the panel, especially over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period. And it's just generally the case that when there's slowing labor demand that you tend to see new entrants hit more. So I'm not personally convinced that right now we're seeing a massive dislocation to the labor market, but it could happen over time. Where I think I want to end up, though, is, again, it ties back, I think, in some ways, Wendy, to how you were thinking about some of the issues, which is short of that extreme version of the world where there's just this collapse in wages, collapse in the labor market, where we're in that sort of almost apocalyptic version of things. The way I think about these productivity enhancements, especially from AI, is you could produce the same amount of output with a lot fewer workers. And I think that's what a lot of people have in their heads when you see headlines like AI will be destroying this many jobs, or there are going to be millions of people who are unemployed forever. I think it's equally important to remember you could do the same amount of output with fewer workers, or you could do a lot more output with the same number of workers. And the result there depends a lot on other factors. You can't, I think, as your paper demonstrates clearly, simply say, here's a supply shock. I know in all states of the world what the outcome is going to be across macroeconomic variables. The outcome is going to depend on lots of things. The demand points that I made before. So if we're seeing really clear use cases for AI that is driving huge productivity for firms and driving up, as a result, profitability, well, there's more aggregate wealth, there's potentially more aggregate income, which could drive more demand, which allows for more labor demand, potentially in other parts of the economy. But it also depends, very much like you said, Wendy, on policy, fiscal or monetary. And so let's just assume that we're going to get, before too long, to a version of the world where the supply boosting effects of AI dominate the demand boosting effects. What should that mean? Well, in some sense, you have this increase in the level and growth rate of potential GDP. So there's slack opening up in the economy. So all else equal, and standard reaction function from a central bank would be more accommodative than it would have been otherwise, stimulating the economy to take up that building slack. And that could be allowed because productivity could be, at the margin, disinflationary. Does that mean that inflation is higher or lower at the end of the day? Well, I think that's the point. You can't simply take the partial derivative view, the partial equilibrium view on these sorts of things, that disinflation, that productivity growth could be disinflationary. The question is, where do we end up on net? Fiscal policy in principle could work the same way. If you see an increase in slack in the economy, you could have more stimulative fiscal policy. If growth is fundamentally stronger in the sort of extreme, sort of happy version of the world where productivity growth is now 2 or 3 percentage points higher, it means that the long run fiscal outlook is more benign. And so there's more fiscal space. And so you could have a version of the world where fiscal policy helps take up that space. I think that's another part where your careful taxonomy forces people to be much more precise about what kind of shock are we talking about, what's the transmission mechanism to the economy, and then are there some feedback loops where we might have a different effect in general equilibrium. The reality, of course, in the short run depends a lot on if it's the policy channel, policymakers recognizing what's going on, making the right diagnosis. So again, I'm sort of echoing or following in your footsteps there, Wendy, with sort of what the policy recognition lags might be. But it's a critical component, especially in the line of work that I'm in, where markets are trying to think about not just what are the mechanisms at play, but what's the ultimate outcome. The ultimate outcome is going to be the net of a whole set of forces that we have to try to think through sequentially. So anyway, those are some of the things that are occupying my time, especially while I lie awake, jet lagged from being on the other side of the world last week.
Thank you, Seth. I have so many questions for you and for Julia, but before I get to those, Catherine, you've done a ton of work, some of which has been published at Brookings, thinking about how climate-related factors matter for inflation. So, or matter for prices or matter for the economy. I don't mean to make it go narrow. Tell us about your work.
Sure. Thanks so much. It's an honor to be on this panel. It's not often that energy economists get elevated to the cool kids table and get to talk about macroeconomics, but yeah, I'm happy to be here. I also found the taxonomy very useful, kind of boiled down for someone who's not a macroeconomist. It's useful to think about these things at a high level. So I wanted to talk about 3 things. One is electricity prices, in part because of the link between data centers and electricity use. They've been on people's minds a lot. The second is oil and gas prices, and the third is climate-related shocks to expenditures related to the Brookings paper that you mentioned. So, as I said, electricity prices have been on everyone's mind in a way that electricity economists are not used to. But I should remind us that at a high level, kind of average electricity prices nationwide have declined in real terms, and that's through 2024. And that's kind of a continued trend. We're used to seeing, declines in electricity prices over time. But that masks real variation along two dimensions. One is regionally. So California, New York, to a lesser extent, the Middle Atlantic have seen increases, while some of the Midwestern states have seen, literally real decreases. And it also masks variation between the commercial side of the retail electricity sector and the residential side. So where commercial and industrial, perhaps relevant for something like your production function channel, haven't seen as large increases as people have seen on the residential side. So there are a host of explanations for this that people have dug into. Definitely data centers and in general expanding demand for electricity is at the top of everyone's list. And the demand growth outside of data centers is driven by adoption of electric vehicles, people transitioning to heat pumps and replacing, using their gas furnace with using electricity to heat their home. So the thinking there is that those demand growth can lead to an increase in prices. That's kind of the typical Econ 101. The demand shifts out, the price goes up version of the story. But we have to remember that electricity prices are regulated. And so kind of typical Econ 101 mechanisms don't always work. And so there is some thinking that as demand expands, you're taking some fixed cost and just spreading them over a higher quantity. And so that might be a driver for lower electricity prices going forward. And the other part of the regulated, the other reminder that this is a regulated industry, the regulators are worried about data centers and data center demand driving up residential electricity prices, and so are coming up with some kind of tariff structures that try to isolate the payments made by the data centers and don't impose those on the rest of the customer base. The extent to which they've been successful at that, I think, remains a question. And as I said, definitely in some parts of the country, like the Mid-Atlantic, where data center demand growth has been really high, they have seen increases in electricity prices. So, more people than normal know about something like the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, PJM capacity markets. There was a tenfold increase in the prices for capacity in that important market. So that, that wouldn't necessarily get tied directly to data centers, but data centers had to have played a role there. So that's one explanation, expanding demand growth. A second explanation, which I'll get to when I talk about climate change, is just the increase in the number of severe storms we're seeing. Electricity infrastructure is pretty exposed in most parts of the country. So, if that's getting knocked down a lot and the firms have to pay to rebuild it, that's a cost. The third explanation is just, we invested a lot in the electricity infrastructure in the Eisenhower era. There's kind of a life cycle of the equipment. And so we're doing a lot of replacement of 60, 70-year-old poles and infrastructure that's been around. And so that costs money. And then the fourth explanation that people are thinking about is the renewables. Have renewables driven prices up? Have they let them fall down? And here the literature suggests that it depends what kind of renewable you're talking about. That if states have had huge incentives for adoption of rooftop solar, then that's led to an increase in prices. But the more grid scale renewables have actually driven prices down. Okay, so on the oil and gas side, everyone's talking about the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic and supply chain disruptions. The other thing that happened in 2022 was Russia invasion of Ukraine. And so that certainly led to a spike in natural gas prices. We saw prices above $9 per MMBTU, and they're typically around $3. Brent oil prices spiked above $135 when they're typically in the kind of $60 to $70 range. So those were some really big increases in crucial energy prices. Since then, generally oil prices have been down. Over the last year, they've been very kind of flat and not very volatile, really holding fast in the $60 to $65 range. Gas prices have been a bit more volatile, and gas prices also, and by gas, I mean natural gas, not gasoline. Gas prices are coming up again recently and also regionally vary. So there's some parts of the country that are more tied to gas markets in the rest of the world, and gas prices in the rest of the world are much higher than in the US. And so New England, for instance, is subject to all the shocks that the Europeans are experiencing for natural gas. And going forward, I expect that we'll see more increases in natural gas prices. Basically, as we build more infrastructure to export US natural gas, we will become more closely tied to markets elsewhere. And as I said, in general, US prices have been lower. So to the extent we get tied to the European or Japanese markets, prices will go up. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to talk a bit about climate change. And as Wendy indicated, we have a recent paper that came out in the Brookings papers on economic activities, really trying to add up all the ways in which US households are experiencing climate change from an economics perspective. And I think one of the main messages that we came up with is that I think maybe going back to when we talked about global warming instead of climate change, people still think about climate change mainly as kind of impacting temperatures. But we find that the vast majority of the way in which US households are experiencing it is not through temperatures, but is through extreme weather events. So for instance, we see that a major driver of the way in which climate change is impacting US households is that insurance prices have gone up. And so that's going to be, show up in the housing price column. And for the average household, it's always a little bit difficult to attribute, we had storms even before we had lots of climate change. So how much of the increase in storms and the increase in wildfires is driven by climate change? Doing a rough attribution there, we ascertained that about $600 is the expenditure that the typical US household is seeing in their insurance bill because of climate change, but that in 10% of the counties, that's greater than $1,000, that there is, again, some real regional variation. Places like California, where there are lots of wildfires, places like the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast, where there have been hurricanes, are seeing real, very big increases in their insurance prices. So, yeah, as I said, happy to be included in this conversation, and a lot going on in energy and environmental contexts and prices. So, maybe somebody like me will be invited back in the future as well. Thanks so much.
That was super. Thank you, Catherine. And, to be clear, I had to write a paper and organize an event to get to the cool kids table, so that I could be with all of you. All right, so let's start with Julia. So Julia, you invoked the word transitory.
I
And
did indeed.
so when I was thinking about whether or not the inflationary impulse in 2022, 2023 was going to be transitory, I thought it would be transitory to the degree that it was being driven by demand. I was well aware that there was a huge fiscal, response.
Yes.
There was a huge fiscal impulse. People had tremendous financial resources, and that this was going to boost inflation. But I had a decent sense that that's not going to last forever. That's going to be a burst of spending, and the effect on inflation will be Transitory.
Transitory, yes.
Now, it was more persistent than I thought it would be if it was demand driven.
Yes.
And I'm gonna say, well, I'm gonna, do you agree? I mean, why do you think it was persistent? I was gonna try to answer my own question, but that's bad moderator.
So, there's a number of interacting pieces going on. One, yes, the COVID sort of cash support was a one-time, 3-time, but one-off source of support. Other aspects, the unemployment supplement and the child tax credit provided some layered and ongoing support for a while. And in general, it kicked off the accommodation, the go big, go early approach to both fiscal and monetary policy kicked off a very strong cycle. So it was, while the fiscal support was largely one off, the cycle was, the labor market was very strong. That kicked us into a nice virtuous cycle of real wage gains and spending that proved extremely resilient to the pullback in fiscal support. So I think number one, like that's the second strongest labor market I've ever seen. The strongest is of course the late 90s. To sort of Seth's discussion of AI, a big contrast between the late 90s and now and the technology leaps forward is that helped boost growth because it was coming in a demand-friendly environment rather than a way to cut costs, as AI is being looked to now. But yeah, I think it proved persistent, one, because the cycle was very strong. And remember, we had this unusual element of what we could spend money on became very constrained, and that channeled purchases into a narrower set of goods and amplified. So I think the strength of the cycle is one, and then just the second and third round effects became more, that is feasible in a strong demand environment, right? So if you've got higher car prices, you can raise your insurance premiums, you can charge more for car rental, you can do all that second and third round activity because it's not, you're in a demand friendly environment. And I kind of think about that now when I think, okay, is the stance of monetary policy. I know the main thing of what's going on right now isn't driven by monetary policy and whether it's easy or tight. But I think one signal I take from the fact that tariffs, companies are having a hard time passing them along because there is a strong demand response. You see this in some of the Fed surveys. They'll test it out and then consumers are extremely price sensitive because it's not a demand friendly environment. And so maybe that's an indication that, or confirmation, that actually policy isn't easy despite a high stock market. It may be somewhat tight because the margin seems to be that companies facing tariff and cost pressures is to reduce their demand for labor and cool off the labor market. To me, that's evidence that the stance of policy isn't easy. It might be slightly tight because you're just not in a strong demand environment. That's how I kind of judge the stance of policy. So a few answers there.
That's great. And you mentioned, so the stance, where we are in the business cycle, or at least
Right.
I'm gonna summarize some of what you said that way. And Seth, you made some of those same points in your remarks, that where we are in the business cycle matters. And so what comes out of all this literature I read is that like it really matters how much capacity firms have and whether or not they are capacity constrained either because demand's really strong or capacity constrained because maybe something bad happened to supply. How do you think about it's one thing to just say it matters where we are in the business cycle, but like, so does it just mean like supply shocks matter when the unemployment rate is low and they don't matter when the unemployment rate is high? Or how do we actually operationalize that concern as we think about how shocks matter for inflation?
Yeah, I guess I would think, taking a page out of your work, I would think about the state of the business cycle as either a transmission channel or an amplification channel. And so if we are thinking about productivity driving up capacity for the economy to produce, and through that inflation, so it's sort of a macro top-down in the flavor of the Phillips curve version of the world, then the starting point from a very, very tight labor market, all else equal, you could potentially see those workers who are displaced find brand new jobs again and not have a big deal. So back in the beginning of 2023, the tech industry as a whole went through a bit of a cycle. They had overhired coming out of COVID and then got into 2023 and realized probably have a lot more people than we needed. Tens of thousands of people were laid off. Nothing whatsoever in the aggregate statistics in terms of U3 showed up. Why? Because the labor market was tight. The workers who lost their jobs were reabsorbed very, very quickly, and as a result, not much of an effect on things. In contrast, if businesses are already finding it difficult to pass on higher costs, and then we have workers losing their jobs, and because of that, aggregate demand falls even further, not just price sensitivity, but now price sensitivity and an income constraint at the same time, pulling back aggregate spending, that could have a much bigger, much more pronounced effect on inflation, because with high unemployment that gets even higher, with the prospect of reemployment getting dimmer, not better, that sort of price sensitivity on the part of consumers could get stronger, and the disinflationary effects could be that much stronger. So I think of it in your taxonomy as either a transmission mechanism or an amplification mechanism.
I want to follow up with what you were talking about, Seth, with AI, and in particular, the way all the optimism about AI is pushing up the stock market. And to the degree that we think that that's all because, the stock market is efficiently reflecting, future productivity gains, and future income gains. This is a main way in which a positive productivity shock can actually be inflationary. If consumers very quickly respond to a positive productivity shock by feeling richer, because their lifetime income is now higher, and that increases their demand before the economy has actually increased its productive capacity, that can actually mean positive productivity shock, higher inflation. Do you feel like are you seeing that? And is that, are these sorts of sort of fun theoretical arguments that are throughout this literature of, no, it's counterintuitive, gotcha. Are these like fun theoretical arguments, or is this actually like, if this was ever going to happen, it surely is happening now?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely part of the real discussion right now, but with a heavy overlay of the world's a messy place, and none of these are things that we can know for sure. So I like the idea in general that AI is this huge phenomenon that will change productivity in the future, increase productivity, and thereby wealth and future income streams. And so could affect spending now, but that has to happen like in the real world. That has to happen through specific companies, through specific equity prices, and in specific portfolios to then drive specific spending. I think that's where it becomes a little bit less cut and dried. So, for example, one of the themes in markets right now is all of this AI spending a bubble? Is it going to fade on its own? I don't think that's the right way to think about it. And then other people say, well, it's just a gold rush. And I'm like, well, hold on, just a gold rush. Remember, in just a gold rush, there's gold and somebody ends up with gold. So it's not as though it's like all going to go away the way it will in a bubble. And in the, late 40s in California gold rush, some people got rich off of gold, and then Levi Strauss as a company came into being and became this huge corporation for many, many decades to come. And so you have these ancillary spillovers. So what does that mean in practice? It means I think there is some of this effect. We can clearly identify the hyperscalers, NVIDIA, as being places where equity prices have gone up. And to the extent that those stocks are in people's portfolio, they're more wealthy and they can spend more. Will that last forever? I don't know. Will it be a straight line for prices there? I'm pretty sure I know the answer is not. That it's not going to be a straight line. Just look at the past couple of days. And so to me, that says it's never going to be the perfect textbook frictionless version of this where you have, some coefficient of intertemporal substitution that's coming into play and we'll be able to write down to multiple decimal points what's going to happen. It'll be much more messy than that, but I do believe there's a version of that going on right now.
Catherine, I want to talk about climate disasters, and we have a question along these lines from hopefully somebody who's tuned in right now. They sent it ahead of time about how, like, our climate disasters. Should we think about climate disasters as being inflationary or deflationary? So there's, I come to this partly from thinking about the literature that was written after the earthquake in Japan that destroyed, obviously, I mean, well, I was going to say obviously not climate related, but like, what do I know? But I don't think climate related. But nonetheless, a natural disaster that ended up destroying energy production, but also destroying big parts of the, other infrastructure, but also made had its own effects on consumer demand and Japan's economy. Are you worried about climate disasters themselves? Like, I understand we talked a bunch about how in expectation climate disasters are raising prices, things like the cost of insuring a home. But the disaster itself, how should we think about, what should we have on our list to worry about how a climate disaster can affect the economy and just because of what we're talking about here, inflation?
Yeah, I guess I think of there being two impacts from any sort of natural disaster. One is like the immediate impact, and there it really depends where the disaster hits. And you talk about kind of rigidities in the production functions, and if some climate disaster hit, God forbid, like a semiconductor fab or, hit a very critical part of the supply chain, that could be really bad. But then the other
Thank you for noting that disasters are not just economic, economic events. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, yeah, clearly for the people who lose their homes in wildfires but the second thing is then the recovery process. So that can be a huge shock to the demand for electricians and roofers and everything that's involved in rebuilding from the disaster. I guess the thing that I think we need to keep in mind as economists is something that the natural scientists talk about with climate change, which is this idea of, they call it compounding. And so basically, like, think about the term climate change, that the world is changing and we're going to see like combinations of shocks in new ways that we haven't experienced in the past. So, they rely on all these models that are projecting what a hurricane could look like if it kind of smashed through DC, Philadelphia, New York, right? We haven't seen that in the past, but going forward, we might see that. And what if we see that kind of early in the hurricane season, right before a big heat wave? That would be a series of events that are different from what we've experienced before, but potentially quite damaging. I mean, in that sense, I worry about the damage to human health. If you have a heat wave when the electricity system is knocked out, that's going to be really bad for mortality in ways that we haven't seen before. But I think you could imagine similar kind of compounding phenomena in a more economic or directly economic context.
That makes so much sense. And it's how so much of the literature grapples with the inflationary effects of the pandemic, in that for a lot of this literature did think narrowly, like, okay, I'm, I was, the pandemic had an effect on supply chains, and it really motivated me to like write a paper about how shocks to the supply chain matter for the economy. There's a bunch of papers like that, but there's a lot of research just thinking about how the pandemic as a thing mattered for the economy and the inflation. And one of the reasons why, it was just impossible to think to like pull it apart and say, well, it's really about this shock and this shock and this shock and this shock, is that the pandemic created so many shocks that all interacted. And yeah, it just made, Julia, that's partly how I was going to answer my question about temporary versus persistent, or transitory versus persistent, in that I couldn't, like, I didn't think through at the time all the ways that these shocks were going to interact.
That's totally fair.
And you're right, Catherine, to note that, I mean, of course you're right, but like, I'm just emphasizing it, that the way that a climate shock can have outsized effects is that it has multiple it creates multiple shocks that interact with each other. So for example, you can have very significant changes in consumer demand. Like there's a climate shock and now everybody wants, toilet paper and, certain medical supplies. And, anyway, it changes consumer demand, but at the same time, it can destroy productive capacity. Mm-hmm. And if those two things interact, which of course they would if the shock was big enough, the effects on the economy and inflation can be really quite outsized.
Yeah, and I guess I would just emphasize they can interact in ways that we're not anticipating because we haven't seen them before. So that's even worse. We're not prepared with enough toilet paper on the shelves because we're not used to this.
Yeah.
And another way I would say, I remember when we were looking at Hurricane Harvey and the destruction of vehicles. One of the dynamic issues in thinking about inflation was there was a lot of pressure on companies not to price gouge. And so that's another sort of element of navigating these supply chain shocks, or the tariff shocks now. And, the president of the United States calling out Walmart for saying in its earnings call that it's going to pass along some prices. There's a social aspect to it that you have to think, okay, what is the dynamic of this event? Can I weather this and absorb it in my margins to avoid this kind of negative publicity or a hit to my, brand capital? And so I remember companies coming out after Hurricane Harvey sort of actually turning it around and saying, we are not going to raise our prices in the Houston area. We are going to, so that was a very interesting, example of it's not always textbook, right? There's a sort of dynamic game that firms have to play in addition to sort of the spot circumstances that we find ourselves in with natural disasters.
Seth, and this will be a question for you as well, Julia. Both of you think a lot about economic forecasting. Catherine, I'm going to take, I'm just going to assume they're like, that's not how you're like spending your days. Okay. So, when you're thinking about forecasting, what are the potential, like we have some shocks that we know that we are experiencing right now. So yes, please list those. But what I also want to know is what's like on your radar to worry about over the next few years. So Seth, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I'll do specifics on three of the topics that we brought up here because I think they matter in very specific ways. One is tariffs. So we have, as I like to say often, the easiest way to forecast what tariffs are going to do is to take the whole data set of all those times over the past 40 years where the U.S. has imposed this just large and discrete increase in tariffs and take the average of those effects, and that's your best guess. And you're like, oh, okay, I got one. I think it's very difficult, and some general patterns you learn from history, you learn a little bit from theory, maybe you learn a little bit from natural experiments that are ostensibly similar. You try to put them all together, but when you're trying to think about what the lag between the imposition of the tariff is and when it shows up in the consumer price index, you actually get those published by the BLS, the lag between when the tariffs are published and when it starts to show up into manufacturing output, the way manufacturing output took a big hit in 2018 and 2019 from the tariffs. It's just very difficult. And then you think even more importantly, now we had announcements in April of lots of tariffs, but delayed, deferred, adjusted, modified implementation. And so then the question I think really is the bulk of the effect of tariffs on first inflation and then on economic activity is in front of us or behind us? And I think if anybody knows for sure, they know the answer to that question, they're either lying to themselves or they're lying to you. That's one of the things from a forecasting perspective. The other one is AI. So I spent a bunch, perhaps too much time talking about that. And so how, when, and where are we going to see those gains in productivity show up in the economy and then in the data? And one of the key issues in particular, and you start to go down quasi-philosophical rabbit holes, is, early use cases that were cited were things like customer service, improving customer service. You'll be able to do sort of end the queues quickly. You won't have to be on the phone forever. If you increase the quality of that type of service, but at least initially don't change the number of people working there, you're not going to get an increase in measured productivity in general because quality of service is either not measured or not measured well. And so that kind of adjustment between real and nominal is going to be very hard to pick up in the short run. And so again, the adoption and then the measurement of the effects of AI is something that keeps me awake, at least metaphorically speaking, when it comes to forecasting. And then the last one is something that Catherine spent a lot of time talking to, which is electricity. And so we as macroeconomists, especially those of us who spend a lot of time at a certain central bank that will go unnameless, that will go unnamed, like normally think in terms of core, and then you sort of convince yourself that that's fine for forecasting because you do a bunch of regressions of oil prices and the pass through the core is really small and it fades away quickly, and so you don't worry too much. We haven't talked a lot historically as a profession about what happens to persistent shifts in electricity prices. And I do think the rise in AI powering for data centers, that's a big business. There's a whole theme of powering AI that my colleagues in equity research have been going down. And the projections for the amount of demand for electricity and the shortfall in actual production of electricity generation is huge. So what's going to happen to electricity prices, especially at the retail level? How persistent will that be in CPI headline? But then will it feed through to core in the same way that we think of energy feeding through to core or not? I don't think I've got a great handle on that yet. And I'm not even convinced if I had a great way of doing that empirically on historical data that I would have a great confidence that the regression coefficients are stable. So both Yogi Berra America's greatest philosopher and Niels Bohr, the Nobel laureate, are credited with saying something along the lines of forecasting is difficult, especially about the future, and never has that been more true.
Julia, before I turn it to you, it occurred to me as you were talking, Seth, that there is an aspect of forecasting that I want to ask Catherine about, and it's just this last point, Seth, that you were making. Are energy prices going up, Catherine? And does it matter what the policy response is in the US to climate change? Can you, like, does it, what's going to happen to energy prices?
Simple question.
Yeah.
It's so narrow, right?
And
No,
when?
what'd you say?
And not just what's going to
Yeah.
happen, but also add on when.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, Seth's exactly right. Electricity prices, people are used to very, very consistent, maybe 1.8, 2% growth a year, and we're showing or expecting, 6 in some states, 10% growth in electricity demand over the next 5 years. It's rattling everyone's brains in the electricity world. As I said, I think there's some effort on the part of the regulators to try to make the data centers pay for the data center new load and try to insulate the rest of the customers from that. I'm not sure they'll be successful at that. Yeah, so I project that they will go up. I think the other reason they'll go up is that it's just so hard to build stuff in the US. And yeah, we need to meet unprecedented electricity growth, we need more electricity generation. So how will that get built? Plus the fact that the current administration removed subsidies for, wind and solar, which have been a big part of meeting demand growth. But before that, and in the rest of the world, they're a big part of how countries are adding to their electricity generation capacity. So yes, I think electricity prices will go up. I think the only way they don't go up is if the demand does not materialize in the way that everyone's projecting it to. And if there's a way to get kind of the data centers on the hook for, like, get them to pay for kind of an option. And then if that option doesn't materialize, the utilities will have extra money to pay for their existing fixed costs. But I don't put a super high probability on that state of the world transpiring.
And the deregulatory push with regards to fossil fuels, does that lower energy costs, energy inflation?
No, if anything, I think, as I said, the US has benefited from low natural gas prices for a long time. And part of the deregulatory push is making it easier to build facilities so we can export that natural gas to the rest of the world, which will push up US natural gas prices. I mean, maybe some of that deregulatory push will make it easier to build new electricity generating plants, but I haven't seen that. A lot of the permitting issues are more local or are kind of under the control of individual regulatory agencies like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They're messy and they can't just be solved by an executive order that says drill, baby, drill. So I don't see those going away quickly.
All right, Julia, what's on your list?
So there's a couple of aspects of expectations that are on our radar screen. One is very near term, and that is there was a lot of firms that, according to lots of anecdotes and Fed surveys and so on, were waiting to because they expected deals to be made and tariffs to come down. And so part of the not passing along tariffs was an expectation that you would end up with a lower tariff at the end of the day. That doesn't seem to be panning out as many had expected. So is what we are seeing a big lag, and therefore there is some push coming forward starting in, more in 2026. I mean, I think most of us forecasters have pushed some inflation into 2026, but we don't know exactly how much, right? So that's an area where expectations may have played a role in deferring some of the pass through in addition to sort of the macro conditions. Another area of expectations that we're pondering, and I think, I think some of the hawks on the Federal Open Market Committee have a point here, which is we've been above 2% inflation for 4 years and running without any, 2% in sight. And does that, even though the metrics of inflation expectations, the pricing in financial markets, forecasters, you don't see a big increase in longer term inflation expectations. I don't know. I see in my experience of, running a business and being a consumer in the world, more evidence of inflation creeping into behavior. Small price increases every year in services that have nothing to do with tariffs. And just a kind of understanding that, well, my cost base is more uncertain now. My purchasing power is more uncertain now. I got to kind of find ways to claw back, margin or purchasing power. So there are ways in which I think the length of the miss to the Fed's target may create behavior that is more embedded and persistent in the economy.
All right. We have like 3 more minutes.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to jump in, is there something that you like, parting thoughts you want to leave us with? Is there something that you wish you had said?
I have one thought on AI that I would like to
Yes.
jump in on, because you guys, Seth and Catherine were talking about it through the channel of electricity, which I think is very material and near term. Another way that this question interacts with inflation is, I think one of the big questions around AI, we ponder, the long-term impact on productivity and productivity's channel to inflation, but there's a big question about the ROI. Who's going to pay for this $1 trillion in investment? How many hyperscalers can the economy bear? At some point, somebody needs to pay for this. $1 trillion is a lot of money. The hundreds of billions of dollars that are being talked about is enormous amount of money. And to get a sort of average rate of return, you're going to need consumers and businesses to pay for that through their subscriptions and their consumption of AI. And I think there could be some pressures on software pricing, and companies are gonna try to recoup this investment. And it's one thing when it's free and we're all kind of using free versions and trying things out. It's another when you have to make a decision. Okay, exactly how much does this benefit my business? And how much am I willing to pay for that? And so I see some tensions coming through, not in the distant future, in the next 12 months, probably, of how much are we going to be asked to pay for this and how much are we willing to pay for this is going to be a question for the inflation outlook.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much to Catherine and Seth and Julia. I found this conversation incredibly informative. I hope we didn't just leave our audience with the impression that, I don't know, it's complicated. Though, to some degree, that would just be accurate. But I hope we left you with a more concrete understanding of how at least we're thinking about the different factors that can affect inflation going forward, aside from the usual, hey, look, it looks like aggregate demand is kind of strong and it's pushing down the unemployment rate, and that's like our usual model of how, hot economy means higher inflation. that there are all of these messy things in the world of supply that also matter for inflation. So hopefully we brought a little bit of insight and organization to that messy world. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks, Wendy.